That feeling. You know the one. It just sinks right into your stomach, makes your chest feel tight. It's like this cold, heavy stone you're carrying around. Or maybe a shadow that just follows you everywhere. A constant echo, right? Of moments you just desperately wish you could erase. It's the weight of guilt. That awful ache of regret. And that fantasy, oh man, that painful looping fantasy of just hitting rewind, going back, changing one tiny thing, and the idea of actually letting go of that weight. I mean, for so many of us, it feels more than just difficult. It feels almost wrong. Like maybe it's something we should be carrying, something we deserve.
It is an incredibly powerful set of emotions, isn't it? And often really debilitating. Guilt and regret, they aren't just abstract thoughts floating around in your head. They show up physically, emotionally, they demand our attention, and sometimes, they completely consume it. They tend to pop up from things we feel we did wrong or chances we missed, maybe. They signal this kind of gap, this disconnect between what we did or didn't do and what we value or what we hoped would happen. And because they feel so intensely uncomfortable, well, our natural human reaction is often just to avoid them, push them down, try to get away. But like you said, that weight, it rarely just disappears if you ignore it. More often, it settles in and becomes this chronic burden we carry.
It really can feel like you're stuck in some kind of inescapable trap. It's exhausting. And so in this deep dive, we're going to face that feeling. We're going right at it, head on. We've gathered quite a stack of material for this, insights from different therapy approaches, especially some used for folks who've been through trauma. There's research looking into the nature of emotions like regret, what drives it. And we've also got personal reflections, stories from online forums where people are really grappling with these exact same issues, trying to figure it out, plus some really practical exercises, things designed to actually help. So our mission today is to kind of cut through all the noise, pull out the most useful, the most actionable stuff from these sources. We really want to understand what guilt and regret actually are deep down. Explore the complex reasons they seem to hold on to us so damn tightly. And crucially, we want to shine a light on some concrete, practical strategies that these sources offer. Ways to be able to process these feelings, to challenge them, and hopefully, ultimately, to loosen their grip. Make some space for actual healing, for moving forward.
That's a great way to put it. It really is a journey, isn't it? From being sort of defined and limited by what happened back then to understanding it, learning what you can from it, and then actively choosing, how you want to live now in the present and how you want to build your future. It definitely takes courage, though, and honesty and a willingness to sit with some discomfort. But the potential reward, the relief, the freedom, it's immense. It really is.
Okay, so let's start unpacking this. It's a heavy topic for sure. I think to start, we probably need a clear map, right? Like what exactly are we dealing with here? We use guilt and regret almost interchangeably sometimes in everyday talk, but our sources point out some really important differences. And understanding those distinctions seems like it could be super helpful just for figuring out the specific kind of pain we're actually feeling.
They are definitely distinct, yeah. And recognizing that difference, that's often the very first step towards dealing with them effectively. So one source, looking at it from a cognitive behavioral therapy angle, defines guilt as a very specific kind of self-conscious emotion. Its focus tends to be external, or at least directed towards a particular action or behavior, something you did or didn't do. It's tied to feeling responsible, right, for causing harm maybe to yourself, maybe to others, or for failing to prevent harm when you felt like you should have or could have. At its core, really, is the belief I did something wrong, or maybe I should have thought differently, or felt differently, or acted differently in that specific situation. It's very much linked to a particular event.
I did a bad thing.
Ah, okay.
That clicks. That makes sense. Now let's bring shame into this, because I know that gets tangled up with guilt all the time, but the sources really pull them apart, don't they?
They do, and it's such a vital distinction. As another source really emphasizes, shame is, it's a much more global feeling. It's bigger. While guilt says, I did something bad, shame whispers, or maybe shouts, I am bad. See the difference? It's a fundamental judgment about yourself, a feeling that you are inherently flawed, unworthy, maybe inadequate. Shame isn't really tied to one specific action in the same way guilt is. It's more like this pervasive sense of being defective as a person.
Okay. So guilt, action, shame, identity. I'm a bad person. Got it.
Precisely. And that difference, it has huge implications for how we actually respond when we feel these things. Shame usually makes us want to withdraw, right? To hide, keep secrets, just kind of disappear. It makes us isolate ourselves because we feel fundamentally unacceptable to others and maybe even to ourselves. Guilt, on the other hand, it's still incredibly painful, don't get me wrong, but it has the potential to be more constructive. If you feel guilty about something specific you did, well, that feeling might actually motivate you to apologize, maybe make amends, try to repair the harm, or at least change your behavior going forward. Guilt can point towards a need for repair, for connection. Shame just drives disconnection.
Wow. Okay. So guilt can potentially be a signal flare for positive change if we handle it right, whereas shame is just much more paralyzing, much more isolating. That feels like a really critical difference to hold on to.
It absolutely is. And even within guilt itself, the sources talk about different flavors, different ways it shows up. There's what some call natural guilt. That's like the appropriate proportional remorse you feel when you genuinely have done something wrong. Like maybe you broke a promise to someone you care about. It's usually kind of time limited, right? It eases up after you've taken responsibility, said sorry, or tried to fix it. Then you've got chronic guilt. This is more persistent, often feels kind of out of proportion, maybe not even clearly tied to one specific thing. It can get linked up with long-term stress, anxiety, maybe burnout. It really impacts your overall well-being, your ability to regulate emotions. There's also survivor guilt, which is really complex. It's something people feel after living through a traumatic event where others didn't make it. It often involves these really conflicting feelings, like relief about being alive mixed with this profound remorse, or even a feeling like they shouldn't have survived when others didn't. It's incredibly painful. And finally, they mention collective guilt. This is something individuals might feel as part of a group that's responsible for harm, like feeling remorse for historical injustices committed by your country or community, for example.
Okay, that definitely clarifies the different ways guilt can manifest. It's not just one monolithic thing. But let's move beyond just defining it. Why do people feel guilty, especially after really, really hard experiences? Sometimes even when they were the one who was harmed, like after a trauma. That seems counterintuitive.
Yeah, it does seem that way, doesn't it? Our sources really dig into the thinking patterns behind this, drawing on a framework developed by Kubani and Watson, I believe. They pinpoint 4 core beliefs or cognitions that really contribute to how intense and persistent guilt feels, especially after trauma. But honestly, it applies much more broadly, too. So first is perceived responsibility for the negative outcome. This is the belief that somehow you were the cause or at least a significant contributing factor to the bad thing that happened. Even if logically, looking back, you weren't, emotionally, you feel responsible. Second is perceived insufficient justification for what you did or didn't do. You look back and believe there wasn't a good enough reason for your actions or inaction in that moment. You judge your past self really harshly for not having a better excuse, a better explanation. Third, there's perceived violation of values. What you did or didn't do felt deeply wrong according to your own moral code, your sense of right and wrong, or just who you aspire to be as a person. That clash creates this huge internal conflict and, guilt. And fourth is having beliefs about the foreseeability and preventability of what happened. This is that nagging thought. I should have seen it coming, or I should have known better, or maybe I could have stopped it if only I'd been quicker or smarter or stronger or just different somehow.
Wow. So it's this potent mix of feeling like you caused it, you had no good reason for your part, you violated your own rules, and you could have stopped it if you weren't somehow deficient. That sounds crushing.
It is crushing, exactly. And while this framework came partly from work with veterans, survivals of violence, things like that, the sources are really clear that it applies very broadly. These kinds of thought patterns are incredibly common after almost any significant adversity, trauma, abuse, or even just major personal mistakes that lead to bad outcomes. It's the mind's way, often a really misguided way, of trying to make sense of something awful by assigning blame. And very often that blame gets turned inward onto the self.
And when this guilt isn't helpful, when it's out of proportion or becomes chronic, like you mentioned, what are the negative effects? How does it actually hurt us long term?
The sources are very clear about the damage that unhelpful or excessive guilt can do. Because the feeling itself is so uncomfortable, so painful, a really common response is just avoidance. People try really hard not to think about the event or the mistake or the feelings themselves. They might push the memories away, distract themselves constantly, avoid anything that reminds them.
Which seems logical on the surface, right? If it hurts, don't touch the hot stove.
Right, seems logical. But ironically, that very avoidance prevents the memory from being properly processed and integrated in a healthy way. The sources point out that avoidance can actually maintain the distress, especially in trauma-related stuff like PTSD. The memory doesn't fade or become just another part of your life story. It stays unprocessed, raw, intrusive, and still hooked into that intense emotional pain. The other major negative impact is rumination. This is different from avoidance. Instead of pushing it away, people get stuck in this cognitive loop. They replay the situation over and over and over in their minds. They dissect it, analyze it, constantly looking for the flaw, the mistake, the thing they did wrong. It's an endless, torturous, if only I had, or why did I cycle? This isn't productive problem solving, not at all. It's more like mental self-flagellation.
And the sources are clear that rumination doesn't actually lead anywhere helpful,
Yeah.
right? It doesn't bring resolution.
Not even close. Rumination actually tends to strengthen those unhelpful beliefs about responsibility and blame. It keeps the negative feelings very much alive, very central to your experience. It's this really painful cycle that offers no escape hatch, no path to healing or moving on. So you're either trying desperately to avoid the memory, which keeps it potent, or you're replaying it in this hypercritical loop, which just reinforces the pain. It's a really difficult trap to get out of.
It really sounds like it. Okay, so we've got a better handle now on guilt and shame, the different types of guilt, why it pops up, and the negative impacts of either avoiding it or getting stuck ruminating on it. Now, let's bring regret back into the conversation more fully. How does regret differ from guilt exactly? And what's its unique kind of weight?
Right, regret. While it often shows up alongside guilt, its focus is slightly different. As one source explains it, regret is the emotion we tend to feel when an outcome was undesirable, and we specifically attribute that outcome to our own decisions or actions. It's different from just feeling disappointed, where maybe the outcome felt like it was outside your control. Regret is fundamentally linked to the belief that you could have chosen differently. You could have taken a different path and maybe, just maybe, gotten a better result.
Okay. So disappointment is like, oh, well, that's too bad, nothing I could do. But regret is more like, ugh, why did I do X? If only I'd done Y instead.
Exactly right. It carries that heavy what-if feeling, that sharp awareness of a road not taken. And research that one source mentions points to some common areas where regret tends to show up in people's lives. Things like education choices, career paths, romantic relationships, parenting decisions, efforts towards self-improvement, even leisure time, how we spent it or didn't. These are all areas where we generally feel like our decisions have a pretty significant impact on our lives, our well-being, our future possibilities. But maybe the most powerful insight from the research on regret, something highlighted in one source that references Dr. Brené Brown's work, isn't actually about the actions we regret taking. It's about the actions we regret not taking.
Oh, what kind of actions are those?
Our failures of courage, that's the term used. These are the moments when we held back because we were afraid. The times we didn't speak up, didn't say how we really felt, maybe didn't set a boundary that needed setting, or we didn't prioritize our own needs, or we didn't step outside our comfort zone to chase an opportunity. It's the regret of playing it safe, essentially, and missing out on potential connection or growth, or maybe even joy.
Wow. That resonates pretty deeply. It's not just the outright mistakes we made, but the possibilities we let drift away because we were scared. That feels incredibly poignant, actually.
It really does, and this is part of why regret can feel so painful. It often involves blaming ourselves for not being brave enough, or not trying hard enough, or just not being different somehow. And like shame, it can lead to feelings of disconnection. Disconnection from that potential version of yourself you didn't quite become. And sometimes disconnection from other people, if the regret involves relationships. It can be particularly tough if you already struggle with accepting accountability, because regret really forces you to look at the impact of your own choices.
And you mentioned there's an interesting finding about the timeline of regret, too. Short-term versus long-term.
Yes, exactly. Research suggests there's often a difference. In the short term, like right after something happens, we tend to regret actions we took, especially impulsive things that backfired, maybe saying something mean in a fight or making a hasty decision. But over the long haul, when we look back on our lives, the regrets that tend to loom largest are often about the actions we didn't take, the missed opportunities, the relationships we didn't pursue, the dreams we put on a shelf.
That long-term regret of inaction?
Yeah.
Yeah, that feels almost heavier somehow, because there isn't one specific moment you can point to and say, I wish I could undo that. It's more like this vague sense of a whole different life path that just wasn't explored.
It's the cumulative weight, isn't it, of all those opportunities foregone. However, one source does wisely point out a potential silver lining here, much like with guilt, actually. Regret, if we can approach it constructively, can be an incredibly powerful teacher. It forces us to reflect on what really matters to us, where our true values lie. It shows us where maybe we compromised our own courage. And again, referencing Dr. Brown's perspective, it can serve as a call to courage and a path toward wisdom. It can inform the choices we make now, urging us to step more fully into our lives today, to take the actions we might regret not taking in the future.
Okay, so summing up so far, Guilt and regret are both heavy burdens rooted in the past, but they have distinct flavors. Guilt is more tied to perceived harmful actions or inactions. Regret is linked to undesired outcomes stemming from our decisions, or, maybe more painfully, our inactions, those failures of courage. Now we get to the really crucial part. Why does this weight stick around so stubbornly? Why is letting go just so incredibly challenging for so many people?
Yes. Understanding why we hold on so tightly is absolutely key before we can even think about how to release it. The sources offer several really powerful explanations for why this weight persists. We already touched on avoidance as a factor that keeps the pain alive, but it's worth stressing just how central it is. These emotions are deeply uncomfortable, right? The memories linked to them are often painful, sometimes even traumatic. Our nervous system is basically hardwired to avoid pain, so naturally we push away thoughts about the event or the feelings themselves. But as we discussed, this avoidance creates this barrier. It stops us from processing the experience properly, and it ends up trapping the emotion and the memory in this kind of chronic state of distress. Another really deeply ingrained reason is the belief, sometimes conscious, sometimes not, that holding on to the guilt feels like a necessary self-punishment. For many people, especially if their actions genuinely did cause harm to someone else, feeling that constant guilt can feel like the only right response. One source notes that clients sometimes explicitly say they feel they deserve this suffering. The guilt becomes a kind of ongoing penance,
Yeah.
a way of acknowledging how serious what happened was and showing, maybe just to themselves, that they're not indifferent to it.
So letting go could feel like you're letting yourself off the hook too easily. Like you're minimizing it, saying, oh, it wasn't that bad, when actually it was bad.
Precisely that. And tied right into that is the fear that letting go means you're somehow a bad person, or that you're diminishing the seriousness of what happened or the impact it had on others. If someone was hurt by your actions, releasing your own guilt might feel like you're disrespecting their suffering. Or if the person involved has passed away, it might feel like you're dishonoring their memory by not continuing to carry that burden. This fear can be incredibly powerful. It acts like the self-imposed cage, keeping the guilt firmly locked inside because the alternative feels almost morally wrong. And then there's this often unseen force, perfectionism. Holding these rigidly high, often completely unattainable expectations for yourself, well, it means that any mistake, any time you fall short of that impossible standard, isn't just seen as an error, it's seen as a catastrophe. And that just fuels intense guilt and shame. Perfectionism can be internally driven, this constant striving for an ideal you can never reach, or can come from an external need for approval, needing others to see you as flawless, always.
So if your internal programming basically says you must be perfect, then any tiny slip-up generates this massive, disproportionate wave of guilt.
Exactly. A small mistake becomes proof that you are fundamentally flawed, which, you'll notice, brings us right back to that shame-based belief, I am bad. Sources note that this kind of heightened sensitivity to guilt and imperfection is particularly strong in certain mental health conditions, like OCD, for instance. Individuals might feel completely unwarranted guilt about thoughts or actions, fearing they've caused harm unless they perform rituals absolutely perfectly. Now, this whole picture gets significantly more complex and, frankly, more painful when we factor in situations involving trauma and abuse. Unwarranted guilt and shame are tragically common responses for survivors. People might internalize the blame that abusers heap on them, that see what you made me do manipulation, or they might blame themselves for not having somehow prevented the abuse, for not fighting back harder, for not leaving sooner, or just for not having been better or different in some way that might have avoided them being targeted in the first place.
So the blame gets unfairly placed onto the victim, and they end up carrying it as their own.
Tragically often, yes. The sources explain that sometimes guilt or shame reactions in those dangerous situations might have even served a kind of twisted survival function at the time. For instance, maybe exhibiting shame or appearing submissive was unconsciously learned as a way to try and de-escalate a situation or prevent even further harm. The body and mind learn that certain responses, even ones that feel deeply shameful later, were linked to survival in that critical moment. Furthermore, if someone experienced repeated abuse or neglect, especially during their developmental years, it can profoundly damage their fundamental sense of self-worth, their feeling of safety in relationships. They might come to feel inherently bad or unworthy of love and kindness. And this makes it incredibly difficult, sometimes even physiologically difficult, to receive compassion from others or even to offer it to themselves. Because the very act of trying to be kind to yourself might activate the threat system, unconsciously reminding them of past experiences where care was absent, or maybe even harmful.
So self-kindness itself can feel alien or even dangerous because of that past conditioning. Wow.
It can create that very real internal conflict, yeah. It makes the soothing system, the part of us linked to compassion, feel unsafe or inaccessible, And all of these factors, the avoidance, the perceived need for self-punishment, the fear of minimizing harm, perfectionism, and the deep wounds left by trauma or abuse, they all feed into and are reinforced by rumination. That endless cycle of replaying the past. The sources really highlight how hindsight bias is a major culprit fueling this rumination. Hindsight bias is when you judge your past actions or decisions using the knowledge, perspective, and emotional capacity you have now in the present. You look back, and everything seems so obvious, right? And you torture yourself thinking, I should have known, it was so clear, how could I have missed that?
But it wasn't clear then, not with the limited information and the state of mind you were actually in at that moment.
Precisely. Hindsight bias makes it feel like you had perfect foresight back then, and that's just a painful illusion. It fuels the self-criticism and keeps that rumination cycle spinning and spinning. So the weight sticks around because of this really complex interplay. Avoidance, self-punishment, fear, perfectionism, past wounds, and that distorted lens of hindsight bias. It's a deeply entrenched problem.
It really sounds like it.
Yeah.
A knot that's hard to untangle. But the good news is, the sources offer some really powerful ways to start breaking free from this cycle, and it often starts with challenging the very thoughts that are holding that weight in place.
Yes, absolutely. The cognitive strategies are a fundamental part of most therapeutic approaches for dealing with unhelpful guilt. And the core aim here isn't about trying to excuse past behavior necessarily. It's about evaluating whether those intense feelings of guilt and responsibility are truly proportional to what actually happened, or, as is often the case, are they inflated and distorted by all those factors we just talked about. Very often, people significantly overestimate their actual role in a negative outcome.
But how do you even begin to challenge beliefs that feel so deeply true? Like, it was all my fault. That feels like bedrock reality for some people.
It does feel that way. One really effective, very tangible technique that's described is using a responsibility pie chart or even using physical objects. The goal is to take that abstract, overwhelming feeling of, it's all my fault, and make it visual, make it physical. You distribute the responsibility among all the different factors that actually contributed to the event happening. You start by brainstorming everything and everyone that played any role, no matter how small it seems. And this list has to go beyond just yourself and maybe the other main person involved. It needs to include circumstantial things like what was going on at the time, actions or maybe inactions of other people, even people who weren't directly there but maybe could have been, like authorities or institutions. You also look at broader cultural norms that might have influenced things, developmental factors like how old you were, what your maturity level was at the time, societal influences. You cast a really wide net.
Can you give us an example from the sources, make it a bit more concrete?
Yes, absolutely. The case of Isabella, who experienced abuse when she was a teenager, is a really powerful illustration of this. Her initial guilt felt total, just crushing. She blamed herself completely for not fighting back, for not telling anyone what was happening. But working with her therapist, they built this really comprehensive list of all the contributing factors. And that list included, yes, the man who abused her, obviously, but also potentially her parents for maybe not noticing changes in her behavior, his wife for possibly enabling him or ignoring signs, government officials responsible for education about abuse prevention and support systems, teachers at her school who might have noticed changes, her doctor who might have picked up on physical or emotional signs, broader cultural norms around the sexualization of young girls, or beliefs about consent, or victim-blaming attitudes in society. And yes, Isabella herself was on the list, representing how she initially saw her own role.
Wow, that's a much, much wider net than just focusing on the abuser and the victim.
Absolutely, and that is precisely the point. Recognizing the multitude of factors that are often tangled up in complex negative outcomes. Then you take either a pie chart, draw a circle, and divide up 100% of the responsibility visually. Or, often even more powerfully, you use physical objects like pebbles, marbles, maybe little pieces of clay, even something like lentils or beans. You gather a pile that represents the total responsibility for the event. Then the person physically takes that pyre and assigns a portion of the objects to each factor or person on their list. They literally place the objects into separate piles or into different sections of the pie chart. Often they're guided to place the objects representing their own perceived responsibility last. And the sources really highlight the incredible power of doing this physically, of literally taking that burden off your own shoulders and seeing it distributed among many, many different factors. Just looking at those piles afterwards, seeing how much responsibility is held by the perpetrator, by societal factors, by other people, and seeing how much smaller the pile representing your own responsibility actually is compared to how it felt. That can be incredibly impactful. Taking photos of the result can serve as a really tangible reminder later on of this more balanced, more realistic perspective. It transforms that feeling from it's all me to something more like, okay, I was one part of a much larger, much more complex picture.
That visual and physical process.
Right.
Yeah, that seems absolutely essential for shifting something that feels so heavy emotionally.
It really helps ground the cognitive shift in a tangible, felt experience. Another really critical cognitive strategy directly tackles hindsight bias. That huge problem of judging your past actions with the knowledge you have now. It's just so easy to look back and think, I should have known that would happen, or it was so obvious I was making a mistake. But you're not the same person now, and you didn't have the same information back then.
Right. It feels crystal clear now. But how do you really, truly internalize that you couldn't possibly have known then? How do you make that stick?
One source uses a really simple, but I think very effective analogy. Imagine someone who has never, ever seen an electric iron before. They don't know what it is. They pick it up, maybe out of curiosity, touch the hot metal plate, and bam, they get burned. Now, you wouldn't blame them for that first burn, would you? They had absolutely no knowledge of the danger. But if they then, maybe with a bandage on their hand from the first burn, picked up that same iron again the next day and touched the hot plate again, well, then you probably would blame them for the second burn. Why? Because they gained knowledge from the first experience. The conclusion from the analogy is pretty simple. You're blamed for something when you know the danger, but you're not blamed when you genuinely don't know. Now, apply this directly to the past event you feel guilty about. The technique guides you to really intensely focus on the specific moment the decision was made or the event occurred. What did you actually know? What did you actually believe? What were you actually paying attention to at that exact moment? Not now, years later, with all the lessons learned and wisdom gained, but then let's use Isabella's example again. At age 13, in that situation, she was absolutely certain deep down that telling her parents about the abuse would not help. That was her firm belief. Now, however misguided that belief might seem in retrospect, it was her reality in that moment.
So, applying the iron analogy, based on her knowledge and belief at 13, she couldn't really be blamed for not telling them because she genuinely believed it wouldn't help, just like the person didn't know the iron was hot the very first time.
Precisely. You couldn't possibly have foreseen the full negative consequences of your actions or your inactions because you simply lacked the necessary knowledge or experience or maybe even the emotional capacity at that specific time. You cannot be blamed for not knowing what was fundamentally unknowable to you in that state, in that moment. Judging your past self with your present knowledge is fundamentally unfair. It only serves to create suffering and keep that rumination engine running. Writing this truth down, I couldn't have known then what I know now, maybe even framing it or putting it somewhere visible can be a powerful reminder when that hindsight bias starts creeping back in.
That really seems to shift the whole foundation of the self-blame, doesn't it? It makes it less about being some kind of fundamentally flawed person and more about just the limitations of knowledge and experience in a specific, difficult moment.
It reframes it beautifully, yes. From a moral failing to more a matter of circumstance and the limited perspective you had at the time. A third really crucial cognitive technique tackles the guilt people feel about choices they made during a traumatic event. Often, people feel intense guilt because they believe they should have chosen a better option, acted differently, but the sources explain that frequently in those extreme situations, people weren't actually faced with real choices at all. They were often stuck in what's called impossible choices. They were in a kind of catch-22 scenario where all the potential options available to them had significant negative consequences. And they were forced, essentially, to pick the least bad one they could see, often while in a state of extreme stress, fear, or even dissociation.
So it might have felt like a choice at the time, but really it was just picking the way you were going to be harmed or the least terrible outcome.
Exactly. A choice between bad and worse, essentially. To help people process this difficult reality, one source describes the tunnel diagram technique. You help the person visualize themselves standing at the entry point of that difficult or traumatic event, like looking down a dark tunnel. Then you map out all the different routes out or the choices they perceived as available to them at that specific terrifying moment. And for each of those perceived options, you then list out the potential positive and negative consequences as they saw them back then, filtered through their fear, their state of shock, their age, their knowledge at the time. Let's go back to Isabella's experience one more time. At age 13, facing abuse, her perceived options might have felt incredibly limited. Maybe just scream for help, fight back, or don't scream, freeze, comply. So you list the consequences she likely saw for each of those then. For scream, maybe a perceived positive was someone might come and help, but the perceived negatives might have been huge. He'll get violent, he might kill me, no one will believe me anyway, I'll get in trouble with my parents for making a scene. For fight back, maybe a positive was it might stop him, but negatives. He'll get much angrier. He'll hurt me really badly, maybe kill me. I'm not strong enough anyway. For don't scream, freeze, comply, perhaps a perceived positive was maybe I won't escalate his violence, maybe it will end more quickly. Maybe I can maintain the facade of normalcy and protect my relationship with my parents. But the obvious huge negative was being abused, and then later dealing with that agonizing question, why didn't I resist more?
Wow. Laying it out like that. And yeah, it makes it starkly clear just how limited and utterly terrifying her options must have felt in that moment from her 13-year-old perspective.
It really does. The diagram helps the person see that when they honestly evaluate the perceived outcomes from their perspective at that time, considering their state, there often wasn't a truly better choice available that guaranteed safety or a positive outcome. Not really. It helps reveal that often there was no real choice, or maybe just no good options whatsoever, despite how it feels now with the benefit of hindsight and safety. And that realization can be incredibly freeing. It can help release that heavy guilt about not having acted differently when you were caught in an impossible situation.
Okay, these cognitive techniques sound like incredibly powerful tools for dissecting and challenging the specific thoughts that create and maintain guilt. But like you said earlier, guilt isn't just happening in our heads, is it? It's felt so deeply in the body, in our emotions.
Absolutely. Guilt has a definite physiological signature. It impacts our nervous system, how we feel physically in our bodies. So addressing it fully really requires engaging with that emotional and bodily experience too, not just changing the thoughts.
So what strategies do the sources offer for working directly with that emotional and physiological weight?
Well, one absolutely vital component, especially when we're talking about trauma-related guilt, is providing psychoeducation on the trauma response. Just understanding how the body and brain react automatically to extreme fear and threat can be incredibly validating. It can directly reduce self-blame. You can explain the concept of the defense cascade. This is the involuntary sequence of responses the body often activates when faced with overwhelming danger it can't easily escape. This cascade frequently starts with freeze, like a deer in headlights, a momentary paralysis to assess the threat. Then, if fight or flight seem like viable options, the sympathetic nervous system kicks into high gear, prepping the body to run or fight for survival. This involves all those physiological changes people might feel guilty about later. Heart pounding, breathing fast, trembling, sweating, maybe getting tunnel vision. And often the shutdown of non-essential systems like digestion, which can lead to nausea or even loss of bladder or bowel control. These are automatic responses, not conscious choices.
Right, exactly the things people often feel deep shame or guilt about experiencing during a traumatic event, feeling like they lost control.
Precisely. And then you can explain dissociation. This is another natural protective mechanism the brain and body can deploy when fight or flight don't seem possible. Maybe if you're physically restrained or significantly overpowered, or the threat just feels too overwhelming to face. Dissociation involves feeling detached from your body, from your emotions, maybe from your surroundings. It can feel like you're watching things happen from outside yourself, or that the experience isn't quite real. It's an automatic last resort survival response, not a conscious decision to give up or mentally check out.
So freezing or feeling detached and unreal, that wasn't a failure of will. It wasn't a sign of weakness. It was the body's own innate survival program taking over when it felt it had no other choice.
Exactly. It shifts the whole understanding, doesn't it? From I chose not to fight back or I chose to freeze to something more like my body's ancient survival system took over automatically to protect me in the only way it knew how in that impossible situation. For Isabella, for example, learning that freezing during the rapes was actually a normal, automatic protective response significantly reduced her profound guilt about not having fought back harder. It validates the reality of the experience and removes that thick layer of self-blame that was rooted in a misunderstanding of basic biological responses.
That kind of knowledge,
Right.
it just feels essential for anyone carrying this kind of burden. it externalizes the blame in a way, doesn't it?
Yeah.
From the individual's character to the hardwired biology of survival.
It really empowers people, giving them a factual, non-judgmental understanding of what was happening inside their own body. Another really powerful technique that works directly with the emotional and physical manifestation of guilt is something called imagery restructuring, or sometimes creating an antidote image. Guilt isn't just a cold thought, right? It's often felt as a physical sensation, like a heavy weight in your chest, a dark stain, maybe a constriction in your throat. People often have a spontaneous mental image associated with this feeling. Isabella, for instance, pictured her guilt vividly as a dark stain or shadow located on her stomach and her throat.
Okay, so the first step is to identify how the guilt actually feels or looks inside you. Make it concrete.
Yes, exactly. You help the person describe it, maybe even draw it. What does the guilt feel like? Where is it located? What does it look like in their mind's eye? Then you work together to create a new image, an antidote image. This new image is designed to embody the cognitive truth they've started to understand through techniques like the responsibility pie or the iron analogy. Truths like, I wasn't solely responsible, responsibility was shared, I couldn't have known or chosen differently back then. The goal isn't just to think the truth, but to see it or feel it represented in this new healing image.
So how did Isabella's antidote image work? What did she create?
She imagined her adult self strong, knowledgeable, the person she is now standing alongside her therapist. In the image, they were looking at her 13-year-old self, who was still visible carrying that dark stain of guilt. Then, in the image, the adult Isabella and the therapist repeatedly said directly to the stain on the young girl, it is not her fault. They were actively infusing the image with that cognitive truth. Then, the adult Isabella, in the image, physically reached out, grabbed hold of that dark shadow on her younger self's stomach and throat, pulled it off, took it over to a toilet, and flushed it away. It was this powerful symbolic act of cleansing herself of that burden. She finished by picturing herself wiping her hands clean.
Wow. It's a really powerful, almost ritualistic kind of visual.
It really is. And the sources describe how this type of image transformation can have a direct, often immediate impact on the physical and emotional feeling of guilt. For Isabella, her subjective rating of how much guilt she felt went from about 40% present down to 0% right after doing that imagery work. She described feeling light and free. This antidote image can then be used in different ways. It can be used to update the original traumatic memory image, kind of editing the old memory with this new perspective. Or it can just be used as a standalone tool, something you recall and bring to mind whenever that feeling of guilt starts to bubble up again. It acts as this powerful internal counterstatement.
So you're not just correcting a thought on an intellectual level. You're literally transforming the visual and physical feeling associated with the guilt.
Exactly. It integrates the cognitive shifts much more deeply, bridging the gap with the emotional and physiological experience. And finally, a really fundamental strategy for addressing the emotional core of guilt and shame, especially the unwarranted kinds, is developing self-compassion. This concept comes up again and again across many different therapeutic approaches for healing from difficult emotions. It's foundational.
Okay, self-compassion.
Mm-hmm.
What does it truly mean to be self-compassionate when you're drowning in guilt or shame?
Yeah.
It sounds almost contradictory.
It can feel that way initially, yeah. But essentially, it's about learning to treat yourself with the same warmth, the same understanding, patience, and care that you would genuinely offer to a dear friend who was suffering or who had made a mistake or was just going through a really tough time. It usually involves 3 core components. First, recognizing your own suffering, just acknowledging that the guilt or shame feels painful, validating that reality. Second, understanding that suffering and imperfection are part of the common human experience. You're not alone in feeling this way. You're not uniquely flawed for making mistakes. It connects you to humanity rather than isolating you. And third, actively responding to your own pain with kindness, with a genuine desire to soothe and help yourself, rather than ignoring the pain, or worse, piling on more self-criticism.
So instead of turning that harsh inner critic loose on yourself, you're intentionally activating your inner friend, turning that kindness towards yourself.
Precisely. And this is incredibly powerful neurobiologically. Self-criticism activates the threat system in our brain and body. It makes us feel attacked, defensive, stressed out. Cortisol floods our system. Self-compassion, on the other hand, is thought to activate the soothing system, sometimes called the care system. This is linked to the release of different neurochemicals like oxytocin and endorphins. This system promotes feelings of calm, safety, and connection. It internally mimics the positive feeling of being cared for by a trusted, kind other person.
And this is where that past trauma or neglect can make things really tricky, isn't it? If you didn't experience consistent kindness or didn't feel worthy of care when you were younger.
Yes, the sources definitely acknowledge that as a significant challenge. If your early experiences were characterized by conditional love or lots of criticism or rejection, then that soothing system might be underdeveloped. Or worse, it might even feel unsafe because feeling cared for or being vulnerable enough to receive care might be unconsciously linked to past experiences of hurt or disappointment. So practicing self-compassion in those cases can feel really awkward at first, uncomfortable, maybe even trigger anxiety. It requires real patience and consistent effort, almost like building a new muscle that hasn't been used much. But the sources emphasize it as absolutely learnable, and it can be truly transformative over time.
Okay, so it takes work. What are some practical ways listeners could start practicing self-compassion, maybe even today? Small steps.
The sources suggest several really accessible approaches. Compassionate touch is one, using physical gestures that are inherently soothing, like gently placing a hand over your heart, or maybe holding your own hand, or even giving yourself a gentle hug. The intention behind the touch is key. Doing it while actively wishing yourself well, offering yourself comfort, and allowing yourself to feel any warmth or soothing that might arise, however small. Another is using calming mantras or phrases. These can be really simple phrases, maybe borrowed from loving kindness meditation practices, but directed inwards towards yourself. Things like, may I be safe, may I be well, may I be free from this suffering, or sometimes even just acknowledging the reality with kindness. This is really hard right now. It's okay to feel this pain. Compassionate self-talk involves actively noticing and counteracting that harsh inner critic. When you catch yourself thinking, you're so stupid for doing that, you consciously pause and replace it with a kinder, more supportive internal voice. Something like, okay, that was a mistake and it feels bad, but I'm learning, or I'm doing the best I can in this difficult situation, or simply, it's okay to feel upset about this. It's like consciously choosing to talk to yourself the way you'd talk to a dear friend facing the same struggle. You can also deliberately practice feeling cared for. This might involve intentionally imagining a compassionate figure, maybe someone you know, a wise mentor, a spiritual figure you connect with, or even just an idealized image of pure, unconditional kindness, and picturing their warmth, acceptance, and understanding flowing towards you, really trying to soak it in. Or it can be as simple as actively noticing and appreciating small moments throughout your day when others show you kindness, and consciously allowing yourself to receive it fully rather than deflecting it. And then in a therapeutic setting, a more advanced technique is sometimes used called the two-chair technique. Here, you literally externalize the critical part of yourself, imagine it sitting in one chair, and then you practice responding to it from a compassionate part of yourself sitting in another chair. It helps to kind of dialogue with and integrate these different internal voices.
Yeah, those definitely sound like practices, not quick fixes. Things you need to cultivate over time.
Exactly. They require patience, persistence, and maybe most importantly, a willingness to tolerate some initial discomfort or awkwardness. Allowing for small steps, celebrating tiny shifts in how you relate to yourself internally, that's all part of the practice itself. It's about consciously, intentionally nurturing a kinder, more supportive relationship with yourself.
Okay, so we've explored these cognitive ways to reframe the thoughts behind guilt and these emotional and physiological strategies, including self-compassion, to work with the actual feelings and bodily sensations. How do we start weaving all of this together? How do we integrate the experience and genuinely move forward, maybe even letting go?
That's the crucial final piece, isn't it? Taking all these insights and practices and actually integrating them into your life in a way that fundamentally shifts your relationship with the past. A key theme that runs through pretty much all the sources is the importance of acceptance. One source puts it very simply, but profoundly. It is what it is. The past happened. It's done. You cannot change it no matter how much you wish you could, no matter how much you replay it, ruminate on it, or punish yourself for it. All the energy you spend wishing the past were different is energy you cannot use to live more fully in the present or to shape your future in a positive way.
So it's about accepting the reality of what happened, even if it was awful, without necessarily condoning it or saying it was okay.
Precisely. Acceptance is not approval. It's simply acknowledging reality as it is or as it was. It's about shifting your focus and energy onto where you do have agency, where you do have power, which is the present moment, and the choices you make going forward from here. Another really vital aspect of integration is reframing mistakes as learning opportunities. Guilt, when it's functioning in a healthy way, often arises when our actions clash with our deeply held values. So when you make a mistake that triggers guilt, it's actually pointing directly to that misalignment. Instead of just getting stuck wallowing in self-blame, you can learn to use that painful signal constructively. You analyze what happened not to beat yourself up, but to genuinely understand the chain of events, the contributing factors, and most importantly, to identify the lesson. What did this experience teach you? About your values, about your vulnerabilities, about the consequences of certain actions or choices. And then the crucial step. Commit to doing things differently next time based on that hard-won learning. As one comment on a Reddit forum wisely put it, mistakes are often our best teachers.
So the pain of the mistake itself can actually become the guide for future growth.
It can absolutely be transformed into that, yes. And this leads directly to another powerful insight shared in the sources. True healing and forgiveness, especially self-forgiveness, is often most powerfully achieved and felt through changed behavior. It's not just about mentally declaring, okay, I forgive myself now. It's about aligning your actions now, in the present, with the values you learned were violated back then. It's about becoming the person you are now, someone who has learned, someone who has grown, rather than staying defined solely by the person who made the mistake in the past. As one source really emphasized, action and follow-through in your behavior is often key to truly finding that forgiveness within yourself.
So you essentially prove to yourself through your ongoing actions that you've actually learned the lesson and changed.
Exactly. You build trust in your current self, in your capacity to live differently. And this connects back profoundly to the idea of how you relate to your past self. It's absolutely crucial to cultivate compassion and understanding for that younger, maybe less experienced, perhaps less informed version of yourself who made the mistake or went through the difficult experience. Remember that phrase? Past me was doing the best they could with what they knew, with what they were capable of emotionally and mentally, and based on what they believed at the time. You simply cannot fairly judge your past self using the knowledge, the skills, the emotional resilience, or the understanding of long-term consequences that you possess now. In fact, the very wisdom and capacity you have today often came directly from navigating those difficult experiences you now regret or feel guilty about. As one source simply put it, you can forgive yourself for not knowing what you didn't know before you learned it, often the hard way.
It's like extending that self-compassion we talked about specifically to that version of you who was in that tough situation back then.
Precisely. It's acknowledging their limitations, their struggles, their perspective at the time without condemning them for it. Embracing a growth mindset is also incredibly helpful here. This is the belief, popularized by Carol Dweck, that your qualities and abilities aren't just fixed traits, but things that can be developed through dedication, effort, and learning. It contrasts sharply with a fixed mindset, which sees abilities as innate and unchangeable. In a fixed mindset, mistakes feel like proof of fundamental inadequacy, which fuels shame and guilt. A growth mindset helps you focus more on the process of learning, putting in effort, continuous development, rather than just on rigid performance outcomes. It allows you to accept that you will stumble sometimes, you will fail to learn occasionally, and that's not a catastrophe. It's just an expected, even necessary part of the learning journey. This mindset directly challenges perfectionism and helps you become more comfortable with the inherent uncertainty and imperfection of life.
Were there any other avenues for healing mentioned in the sources, other tools people might find helpful?
Yes, sources touched briefly on various complementary approaches. Meditation, for example, particularly mindfulness meditation, can be very helpful for quieting that noisy, ruminating mind. It helps increase present moment awareness and can foster a more integrated, less reactive connection between your mind, body, and emotions. Writing letters to your past self expressing understanding, compassion, maybe even forgiveness and validation for what they went through can be a really powerful therapeutic exercise for some people. And some people find great solace in perspective shifts by exploring different philosophical or spiritual perspectives. The Stoic philosophy, for instance, really emphasizes focusing only on what is truly within your control, primarily your present judgments and actions, and practicing acceptance of everything else, including the unchangeable past and external events. That perspective alone can be incredibly liberating for someone stuck ruminating on things they cannot alter. Others might find comfort or guidance in spiritual belief about forgiveness, grace, divine mercy, or perhaps seeing life events, even painful ones, as part of a larger, sometimes mysterious plan or purpose.
And finally, there's a theme that seemed to consistently emerge across pretty much all the sources we looked at. You don't have to carry this burden alone.
Absolutely essential, yes. Trying to carry the crushing weight of deep guilt and regret entirely in isolation is incredibly difficult, maybe even impossible sometimes. Reaching out for support is genuinely a sign of strength, not weakness. Talking things through with trusted friends, supportive family members, maybe wise elders or community leaders can provide validation, different perspectives, and just that basic human connection that is so vital for healing. And critically, the sources strongly recommend considering support from a mental health professional if you're really struggling. Therapists are trained specifically in the kinds of cognitive and emotional techniques we've been discussing today. They can guide you through practices like the responsibility pie, the tunnel diagram, imagery restructuring, and help you cultivate self-compassion in a safe, structured, supportive environment. One source mentioned the importance of whole person care, recognizing that guilt and the distress it causes can impact every single aspect of your well-being, your physical health, your emotional state, your spiritual connection, your intellectual functioning, your relationships. Real healing often needs to address all of these interconnected areas.
Listening to all this, it almost sounds like feeling this kind of heavy guilt, while obviously incredibly painful, might actually be a sign that you have a strong moral compass.
Yeah.
That you care deeply about your impact on the world and on others.
That's a really insightful way to look at it, actually. And one source does point that out. The very capacity to feel remorse, to feel guilt when you've acted against your values, demonstrates a connection to those values. It shows a desire to be a good person, to live ethically. The challenge then becomes learning how to turn that same capacity for care, that same sensitivity, inwards towards yourself, with compassion. That's often the pivotal step towards healing. Seeking help isn't a sign that you're broken. It's a sign that you're actively engaging in the brave process of repair and growth.
Wow. Okay. We have truly taken a deep dive today, hasn't we? Into this really complex, often painful landscape of guilt and regret. We've worked to define these heavy emotions, explored all those layered reasons why they seem to cling to us so tenaciously, everything from avoidance and that feeling of needing self-punishment to perfectionism and the really lasting impacts of trauma. And most importantly, I think we've unearthed some really practical, powerful strategies that the sources offer. Things like challenging our thoughts with tools like the responsibility pie and that iron analogy for hindsight bias, working directly with our emotions and bodies through psychoeducation on trauma responses and using transformative imagery, and cultivating that absolutely essential practice of self-compassion. We've also looked at how to integrate these insights through acceptance, reframing mistakes as learning opportunities, focusing on changed behavior, relating differently to our past selves, embracing a growth mindset, and crucially, remembering the importance of seeking support.
It seems really clear from everything we've looked at that releasing the deep-seated weight of guilt and regret is rarely, if ever, an instant fix. It's not like flipping a switch. It's a process, isn't it? It's a journey. And it requires patience, definitely courage, consistent practice over time, and maybe most of all, a profound commitment to learning how to treat yourself with the same kindness and understanding you would so readily offer to someone else you cared about. It's really about making peace with your history, not trying to do the impossible task of erasing it so that you can more fully inhabit and appreciate your present moment and consciously build the future you want.
And here's where it gets really interesting. I mean, the final provocative thought we want to leave you with today to mull over. What if the heaviest part of the weight of guilt and regret isn't just the memory of the past itself? What if the real weight lies in the very real way that burden limits your capacity right now? Your capacity for joy, for authentic connection with other people, for stepping into courageous new opportunities, for experiencing peace and freedom right now and in all the moments still to come. What possibilities might be waiting in your life right on the other side if you simply chose to begin, even gently, to loosen that grip?
That's a powerful question to sit with, indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. It covered some challenging, but I think ultimately quite hopeful terrain.
Yes, thank you. We truly hope this conversation has offered you some valuable insights, maybe a sense of not being quite so alone in this struggle if you're facing it, and perhaps even some practical tools you can begin to explore on your own journey towards lighting that load. Please take gentle care of yourself as you reflect on all of this.